On a cold Chicago morning, a woman walks into the Cook County Courthouse, her hands trembling, not from the weather, but from the weight of the trial ahead. Danielle Carter has been labeled a traitor, accused of leaking classified information, and the world has already decided she's guilty. But what no one in that courtroom knows is that the real criminals are sitting among them. And the moment the FBI steps in, everything will change. How will Danielle respond to this betrayal? Will justice be served, or will the truth be buried forever? Stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe and comment below where you're watching from. Let's dive into this unbelievable true story. The wind cut through the towering skyscrapers of Chicago, carrying with it the crisp bite of early autumn. The Cook County Courthouse stood like an immovable fortress in the heart of the city, its grand stone facade shadowing the bustling streets below. Pedestrians hurried past, barely sparing a glance at the chaos outside its steps. Danielle Carter stood at the base of those stairs, inhaling deeply, willing herself to move forward. She adjusted the gray blazer that no longer felt like her own, and gripped the handle of her leather briefcase just a little tighter. It wasn't just a courtroom she was walking into. It was a battlefield, and she was outnumbered. "Miss Carter, do you have anything to say about the charges against you?" a reporter shouted, shoving a microphone toward her face. She didn't answer. She had learned that silence was safer. "Are you guilty, Miss Carter?" another voice called. A protester nearby sneered. "Traitors don't deserve trials." Danielle swallowed hard, ignoring them as she ascended the stone steps. The whispers followed her, thick with judgment and certainty in her guilt. It didn't matter that she hadn't leaked the files. It didn't matter that she had tried to do the right thing. The world had already decided. Inside, the courthouse smelled of old wood, stale coffee, and bureaucratic indifference. The fluorescent lights flickered as she walked through the metal detector, the beep echoing louder in her ears than it should have. She barely noticed the security guard who motioned her forward. Her lawyer, Elijah Brooks, stood near the entrance to the courtroom, arms crossed. A seasoned defense attorney, he had the calm confidence of a man who had seen the system fail more people than it saved. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. Danielle exhaled. "As okay as someone facing 20 years in prison can be." Elijah nodded. "Stay focused. They want to rattle you. Don't let them." She glanced at the heavy wooden doors ahead. On the other side, a jury that didn't know her, a judge who probably had a full docket, and a prosecution team determined to destroy her reputation, were waiting. Danielle squared her shoulders. "Let's get this over with." With that, she pushed open the doors, stepping into the lion's den. The courtroom felt colder than it should have. Danielle Carter sat at the defense table, back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap, doing her best to appear composed. Inside, though, her stomach twisted. The weight of the charges against her felt suffocating. Across the room, Victor Reed, the assistant district attorney, adjusted his tie before stepping forward, with the confidence of a man who had already won. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Reed began, his voice sharp and measured. "This case is not complicated. It is a case of betrayal. The defendant, Danielle Carter, a former data analyst at Lansfield Defense Group, had access to highly classified information that later appeared in an unauthorized leak, causing irreparable harm to national security." Danielle clenched her jaw. Irreparable harm. She wanted to scoff. The only harm done was to Lansfield's executives, who got caught. Reed continued, pacing in front of the jury. She was trusted with confidential documents, given access to files that only a handful of people in this country could see. And what did she do with that trust? He turned, eyes locking onto the jurors. She violated it. She sent those files to an outside source, exposing private government dealings, jeopardizing international relations, and betraying her own country. Danielle could feel the eyes of the jury boring into her. 12 strangers deciding her fate. Some of them looked skeptical. Others already seemed convinced of her guilt. "Your Honor," Reed said, turning toward the judge, "the prosecution would like to call our first witness, Miriam Sanders." A woman in her early 40s took the stand, dressed in a navy blazer and pearl earrings. Miriam had been Danielle's closest work friend, or so she thought. Elijah leaned in and whispered, "She's been coached. Stay calm." Danielle nodded, keeping her expression neutral, as Miriam took her oath. Reed approached the stand. "Miss Sanders, can you tell us about your relationship with the defendant?" Miriam folded her hands in her lap. "We were colleagues," she said smoothly. "Friends, even. I trusted her." "And did you ever see anything suspicious about her behavior before the leak?" Miriam hesitated, just enough to make it seem like she was reluctant to answer. "Yes," she finally said. "There were times when I noticed Danielle staying late at the office, printing documents that weren't part of her usual workload. She was always careful, secretive." Danielle felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. That was a lie. She had stayed late because her boss asked her to cross-check financial reports, not to steal classified data. Elijah stood. "Objection, Your Honor, speculation." The judge nodded. "Sustained. Let's stick to facts." Mr. Reed cleared his throat and adjusted. "Miss Sanders, in your professional opinion, do you believe the defendant had the capability to access and leak these files?" Miriam nodded. "Absolutely." Danielle's fists clenched under the table. It didn't matter what was true. They had built their case around a lie, and everyone was playing along. Danielle shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around the armrest of her chair, as the prosecution continued building their case against her. The courtroom buzzed with an energy that was almost predatory. Everyone waiting, watching, ready to see her unravel. Victor Reed stood confidently before the jury, his hands clasped behind his back. He moved deliberately, making eye contact with each juror, as if ensuring his words would stay etched in their minds. "Let's be clear," he said, his voice dripping with conviction. Danielle Carter was not just an analyst. She was a high-level data specialist with access to sensitive, classified information. Files that, in the wrong hands, could jeopardize national security. Danielle felt her lawyer, Elijah Brooks, shift beside her. She could tell he was ready to pounce, but he stayed patient, waiting for his turn. "Now," Reed continued, turning toward the jury, "the defense may try to convince you that this is all a misunderstanding, that Miss Carter is merely a victim of circumstance. But let's look at the evidence, shall we?" A large screen in the front of the courtroom blinked to life. On it, a series of emails, financial transactions, and internal reports were displayed. "These," Reed said, motioning toward the screen, "are emails taken from Miss Carter's work computer. In them, we see evidence of unauthorized access to classified documents. Look closely at this timestamp, 2:47 a.m. That's after hours. Why was she accessing these files in the middle of the night?" Danielle bit her tongue. She knew the truth. She had been asked to review financial inconsistencies, but she never sent those files anywhere. The emails were real, but their intent was being twisted beyond recognition. Reed turned back to the jury. "And if that wasn't damning enough, we have this." He nodded toward a security footage clip that began to play. The grainy video showed Danielle at the office printer, scanning through a thick stack of documents. "Tell me, ladies and gentlemen," Reed continued, pacing slowly, Why would an employee print classified documents at 3 a.m. if not for something questionable? Elijah stood. Objection, mischaracterization. The prosecution is making assumptions without proof that these files were ever leaked by my client. The judge, a stern-looking woman with graying hair and piercing eyes, nodded. Sustained. Mr. Reed, unless you have concrete proof that these files were transmitted to an outside source, I suggest you refrain from leading the jury into speculative territory. Reed pressed his lips into a thin line, but did not falter. He had already planted the seed of doubt. Elijah leaned toward Danielle and whispered, "They don't have direct evidence. That's why they're pushing so hard." Danielle nodded, but it didn't ease the tightness in her chest. The prosecution continued, calling another witness, a former IT security expert from Lansfield Defense Group, a man named Derek Langley. Langley was tall, thin, with a receding hairline and an air of self-importance. He adjusted his glasses as he took the stand. Reed wasted no time. "Mr. Langley, in your professional opinion, could Miss Carter have bypassed standard security measures to access sensitive information?" Langley nodded. Yes, she had the clearance level and the technical expertise to do so. It wouldn't have been difficult for someone with her knowledge. Danielle's heart pounded in her ears. This was exactly how they wanted the jury to see her. Not as a hard-working woman who had simply done her job, but as someone capable of betraying her country. Elijah stood, buttoning his suit jacket, as he approached the witness stand. His voice was cool, controlled. "Mr. Langley," he said, "how many other employees had the same level of access as my client?" Langley hesitated. "A handful." "A handful," Elijah repeated. "Would you say 10 people? 20? Langley cleared his throat. "Closer to 20. Elijah nodded. "So, what you're saying is that 20 people at Lansfield had the same level of access. Yet, only my client, the only black woman in that department, is the one being accused?" A shift in the room. Subtle. But Danielle felt it. Langley swallowed. I can't speak to that." Elijah gave a knowing smile. "Of course you can't." He turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution is asking you to believe that, out of 20 possible suspects, my client is the only one who could have done this. They're not proving her guilt. They're making an assumption." Danielle looked toward the jury. She could see it, the slight flicker of doubt in their eyes. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maybe, just maybe, they were starting to see the cracks in the prosecution's case. The tension in the courtroom was thick, suffocating. The prosecution had been relentless, hammering point after point, painting Danielle Carter as a traitor, a criminal, a woman who had willingly leaked classified information to an outside source. Danielle sat still, her posture straight, though her heart pounded inside her chest. She had barely spoken since the trial began. Elijah Brooks, her lawyer, had advised her to remain composed, let the facts speak for themselves. But the facts had been twisted, manipulated, and now the jury was starting to believe the carefully woven narrative against her. Across the room, Victor Reed, the assistant district attorney, smirked as he approached the witness stand once again. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, adjusting his tie. "Before we close our arguments, the prosecution would like to submit one final piece of evidence." Danielle clenched her fists beneath the table. "What now?" Reed turned toward the courtroom doors. "We have a key witness who has just agreed to testify." Before he could finish, the doors burst open. A sudden hush fell over the room as 3 men in dark suits stepped inside. The air shifted, the weight of authority radiating from them. One man led the way, tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing eyes that missed nothing. He walked with purpose, flashing a badge as he made his way toward the judge's bench. "Your Honor," he said, his voice deep, commanding. "I'm Special Agent Cole Simmons, FBI. We need to speak with you immediately." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Jurors exchanged confused glances. Reporters in the gallery scrambled for their phones, eager to capture what was happening. Danielle's breath caught in her throat. "FBI?" Judge Patricia Holloway raised an eyebrow. "Agent Simmons, this is highly irregular. This is an ongoing trial." Simmons nodded. "I understand, Your Honor. But we have new evidence that directly impacts this case. Evidence that may prove Miss Carter's innocence." A gasp rippled through the spectators. The smirk on Victor Reed's face disappeared. "What evidence?" the judge asked, her tone cautious but intrigued. Simmons handed her a thick folder. "It's all in here, Your Honor. Testimony, surveillance footage, and financial records that reveal a larger conspiracy within Lansfield Defense Group." Danielle's fingers dug into the table's edge. "Larger conspiracy?" Judge Holloway took the file. Scanning the first few pages, her expression darkened. "We need a recess," she said, her voice firm. "I need time to review this." Reed shot up. "Your Honor, this is an attempt to derail—" "Enough, Mr. Reed," the judge snapped, cutting him off. "Court is adjourned for 1 hour." The gavel came down, the sound echoing through the stunned silence. Danielle turned toward Elijah. "What just happened?" she whispered. Elijah let out a slow breath. "I think the truth just walked in." The courtroom was in chaos. Reporters rushed to update their notes, spectators whispered among themselves, and even members of the jury sat stiff in their seats, glancing between the judge and the FBI agents, who had just interrupted the trial. Danielle Carter sat frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. She looked over at Elijah Brooks, her lawyer, who seemed just as stunned. But there was a glimmer of something in his eyes. Hope. Judge Patricia Holloway flipped through the thick folder of documents handed to her by Special Agent Cole Simmons. Her expression grew more serious with each page she scanned. Finally, she placed the folder down and looked at the agent. "Special Agent Simmons, would you care to explain what exactly I'm looking at?" Simmons, tall and composed, stepped forward. His FBI badge glinted under the bright courtroom lights. "Your Honor, this file contains evidence that proves Danielle Carter is not the person responsible for the classified data leak. She was framed by Randall Vaughn, CEO of Lansfield Defense Group, and his associates." A wave of gasps spread through the room. Danielle felt her breath catch. Framed? She had suspected it, of course, but to hear it confirmed by the FBI. It was surreal. Victor Reed, the ADA prosecuting her case, shot up from his seat. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. This trial has been in motion for weeks, and now, at the 11th hour, we're supposed to believe that the defendant was framed?" Simmons turned his sharp gaze on Reed. "Yes." A single word, but it commanded the room. Judge Holloway leaned forward. "Agent Simmons, what exactly does this evidence prove?" Simmons walked to the front of the courtroom, opening the folder and pulling out a series of printed emails and bank statements. He handed them to the judge and then turned to the jury. "Our investigation has uncovered that Randall Vaughn and his team orchestrated this leak themselves. They leaked the documents intentionally to create a diversion while they carried out illegal arms deals with foreign buyers." Danielle's hands gripped the table. She had been right all along. Simmons continued. "When Miss Carter began noticing financial discrepancies in Lansfield's records, Vaughn and his associates saw her as a threat, so they set her up. They altered email logs to make it look like she accessed the classified files after hours. They fabricated witness statements. They even bribed an IT security officer to provide false testimony. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the FBI has obtained surveillance footage and internal communications that confirm these actions. We also have a witness, an insider who worked directly with Vaughn, who is willing to testify." Danielle's pulse pounded in her ears. Someone from the inside was speaking out. Reed's face darkened. And who exactly is this so-called witness? The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open again. A man stepped inside, tall, mid-40s, with thinning hair and a nervous energy about him. Danielle recognized him immediately. Thomas Braden. He had been a senior project manager at Lansfield before he suddenly left the company a year ago. Rumors had swirled about his departure, but no one knew the truth. Simmons nodded toward him. "This is Thomas Braden, former executive at Lansfield. He has agreed to testify that Vaughn personally ordered him to cover up illegal transactions and that Miss Carter was deliberately framed." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even Randall Vaughn, seated at the prosecution's table, tensed. His once smug expression had vanished. Judge Holloway took a deep breath and rubbed her temple, as if trying to process everything. Finally, she turned to Victor Reed. "Mr. Reed, given this new evidence, I think it would be prudent to pause these proceedings and allow time for further review." Reed clenched his jaw, glancing at Vaughn, who was visibly seething. "Your Honor, Enough," she cut him off. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." The gavel came down, sending shockwaves through the courtroom. Danielle turned to Elijah, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did that just happen?" Elijah let out a slow exhale, a small smirk forming. "Oh, it happened. And Vaughn knows. He's in trouble." Danielle glanced toward Vaughn. For the first time since this nightmare began, she saw something new in his eyes: fear. The next morning, the energy in the courtroom was different. The usual confidence that radiated from Randall Vaughn had vanished, replaced by tight shoulders and clenched fists. He sat at the prosecution's table, jaw set, eyes flickering toward the FBI agents seated near the back of the room. Danielle Carter took a deep breath. This was it. Judge Patricia Holloway entered, her gaze sharp as she surveyed the room. "We are resuming trial proceedings," she said, her voice steady. "Given yesterday's developments, the court will now address the new evidence submitted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Ada Victor Reed stood abruptly. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss this so-called evidence. It was presented at the last minute and—" "Denied," the judge interrupted, cutting him off. "The integrity of this case is in question, and this court will hear what the FBI has uncovered." Danielle glanced at her lawyer, Elijah Brooks, who gave her a slight nod. This was their chance. Special Agent Cole Simmons stood, walking toward the front of the room. He placed a thick folder on the judge's bench. "Your Honor, the FBI has confirmed that Lansfield Defense Group was engaged in illegal activity, including money laundering and arms deals with foreign entities. In order to cover up their crimes, they fabricated evidence against Miss Carter." Vaughn stiffened, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. Simmons turned toward the jury. "Not only do we have financial records and surveillance footage proving Vaughn's involvement, but we also have a key witness, one of Vaughn's former executives, Thomas Braden, who has agreed to testify under oath." Murmurs spread across the room. Vaughn suddenly stood, slamming his hand on the table. "This is a witch hunt," he shouted, his usual polished demeanor cracking. Judge Holloway's gavel slammed down. "Mr. Vaughn, control yourself, or you will be held in contempt." Danielle watched it unfold, her pulse racing. Vaughn had spent weeks acting untouchable. But now, he was panicking. Elijah leaned in, whispering to Danielle, "He's breaking." Danielle inhaled deeply. For the first time, she felt the weight on her shoulders start to lift. The truth was finally coming out. The courtroom was still buzzing long after the gavel slammed down, but Danielle Carter couldn't move. The words "motion granted" echoed in her head, over and over. It was over. She was free. She turned to Elijah Brooks, who gave her a rare, genuine smile. "You did it," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Elijah shook his head. "No, Danielle, you did." But the moment of relief was fleeting. As she stood to leave, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, jurors, reporters, former colleagues who once believed she was guilty. And then there was Randall Vaughn. He sat frozen, his face pale, his confidence shattered. His high-priced attorneys whispered furiously, but it didn't matter anymore. The FBI had him. Judge Patricia Holloway turned toward the prosecution. "Mr. Reed, given the overwhelming evidence against Randall Vaughn and the misconduct surrounding this trial, I expect your office will be filing charges against him immediately." Reed hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "Yes, Your Honor." Special Agent Cole Simmons stepped forward. "Your Honor, Mr. Vaughn is now under federal investigation. His assets are frozen, and we are preparing to take him into custody." For the first time since the trial began, Randall Vaughn had no power. Danielle turned to him, locking eyes with the man who had tried to destroy her life. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, what she would say if she ever got the chance. But now, she had nothing left to say. She had already won. Danielle sat on her couch, a cup of coffee going cold in her hands. The trial was over, but she still felt like she was waiting for something. Her phone buzzed. A message from Agent Simmons. "Vaughn was arrested this morning. Multiple charges: fraud, money laundering, obstruction. He won't be seeing the outside of a prison cell anytime soon." Danielle let out a slow breath. It was real. Just as she set her phone down, a knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Elijah standing there, holding a bottle of champagne. "I figured we should celebrate," he said, stepping inside. Danielle laughed, shaking her head. "I don't even know how to celebrate anymore." Elijah popped the cork, pouring them each a glass. "You'll figure it out," he said. "You're free, Danielle. Really free." She clinked her glass against his. For the first time in months, she believed it. Danielle Carter's story is more than just a legal battle. It's a powerful reminder of resilience, justice, and the fight for truth. In a world where power and influence often dictate outcomes, her experience teaches us several valuable lessons. First, integrity matters, even when it comes at a cost. Danielle refused to ignore financial discrepancies, and though she was framed for it, her commitment to the truth ultimately led to her exoneration. In our own lives, standing up for what's right, whether in the workplace, relationships, or society, may not be easy, but it is essential. Second, the system is flawed, but persistence can bring justice. Danielle was nearly convicted, based on fabricated evidence. How many others have faced similar fates? This story urges us to question narratives, seek facts, and advocate for fair treatment in every aspect of life. Lastly, never underestimate the power of support. Without her lawyer, the FBI investigation, and her own determination, Danielle might have been another statistic. Whether facing challenges at work, in legal matters, or personal struggles, having a strong support system can make all the difference. Her story proves that truth and perseverance can overcome even the strongest deception, a lesson we can all carry forward. If you were in Danielle's shoes, what would you do? Would you fight until the very end, one, knowing the risks, but refusing to let lies define you? Or would you stay quiet and protect yourself, you too, avoiding confrontation and hoping the truth comes out on its own? Comment 1 or 2 below. I want to hear your thoughts. And if this story resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more incredible stories like this. Justice isn't always easy, but together, we can keep the conversation going.